on the driver's side engine mount, I cut this corner off because it actually had been rubbing just a little bit on the bolt there. I don't think it ever would have caused a problem, and it was just barely touching it, but I'd rather it wouldn't. One more thing I want to do with these is it seems like the engine mount itself is a little smaller than the distance between these. Because the first time I was tightening them, I was having trouble getting it to torque spec without this whole thing really just bending. Another pain, but I think I know what to do about it. Put these two bolts in here, these 1/2-inch bolts, and then all I gotta do is turn the nuts and it should spread it out again. And once I spread it out, then I can just put a washer inside the engine mount bolt here, and everything should sit much better. Still, these mounts are incredibly disappointing. And this isn't something that was my fault, because these damn adapters came with the rubber mounts. So if it's not obvious, all I'm doing is I jammed these bolts together, so as these nuts are loosened, it's spreading out the ears here. And once it's a little past 90 degrees, because it's going to spring back a little bit, once it's a little past 90 degrees, I'll loosen them up and see how they fit on the mounts. Got a definite bend to it. Let's loosen these off and see how much of that stays. A little bit too much outward bend wouldn't matter, because as soon as you tighten the engine mount bolt, it'll fix itself. Yeah, it's not tilted in anymore, so that might be enough. Oh yeah, there's definitely enough space for a washer in there now. Just put the bolt through the 1/2-inch washer on the inside. Everything should tighten up much better. Now I'll do the same thing for the other side mount. I'll put the washer on the back because if anywhere I want it to move a little farther towards the firewall, but it kind of doesn't matter since you have these adjustment slots in these adapters anyway. I tightened the mount down a bit using just a regular nut to make sure that the bolt would actually come all the way through the nylon on the nylock nut, and it definitely does, so we should still be totally fine. Definitely fits better. Okay, seems like a good fit, and the lock nut is already at the lock threads, so should be totally fine. I just put the transmission jack back under the transmission and jacked it up a little bit so we can take the board out of here. Ratchet strap was just hooked on these bolts going through two of the bell housing bolt holes. Okay, set it down on the ground just like when we were painting, and we will try to get the flex plate bolts torqued. Just put that bolt back in and have the breaker bar against the engine stand. We will put red Loctite on these guys and torque them to spec. And we'll wipe off the mating surfaces one more time. Okay, and we can line up the dowel and slap that on there. Make sure the pads are facing the right way. In this case, the pads are towards the torque converter. There's not too many things you want to use this for, but this is a pretty good application of it. You want to tighten this in a crisscross pattern, just like you're tightening lug nuts. And just kind of put a knee on the engine. We're torquing these to 60 foot-pounds. That means we're ready to drop this thing back in the truck. All the hoses and wires are sufficiently out of the way. The biggest thing is just to go slow and take your freaking time. And this is certainly made a lot easier if you have somebody to help you. You still gotta make this happen. Let's do it. There's really no way to get this in here without hitting everything, but just make sure you're hitting it lightly. See if I can't get a bolt through. What we really don't want to do is tighten a bolt and jam things together. We'll leave them a little bit loose. There's still some wiggle room. Make sure you remember that the top bolt on the driver's side also holds on the transmission dipstick too. I didn't forget it this time, but I usually do. Okay, all 6 transmission bolts are started. I think I'm going to jack the transmission up just a little bit and then push the engine as far back as I can get it. Okay, that's about all the way. Remember, I made these washers for the side to push everything out of the way and make some more clearance. So we gotta get those in there as well. So I'll leave these pretty loose for now, and you don't want to force it too hard, because you could screw up the threads on the bolt as it's going in if you really force it to move everything. So if it takes a lot of force, just push the engine around or lift it up or let it down a little bit until it doesn't. The second side's going to be a bit harder since this side is already in place, so wish me luck. Okay, finally, got all the motor mount bolts threaded in. I went back and make sure the transmission mount studs still lined up and put nuts on them. So the transmission is just about all the way off the jack. The engine is just about all the way off the crane. Let's see, there's 4 sets of bolts left to tighten. The engine mount to block bolts, the engine mount through bolts, the transmission to engine bolts, and the transmission mount nuts. First, I think we need to tighten the transmission to engine bolts. These are not easy to get to, so you gotta do whatever you gotta do for each one. So there are 6 of these bolts, 2 on each side and 2 up top. We'll snug them all down, then go all the way back through and torque the ones we can, and the ones we can't, just get them nice and tight. The top 2 are sometimes easier to get from here, and sometimes you can get like a really long extension, some swivel sockets, and come all the way back behind the transmission and do it, but when the transfer case is there, it's actually just easier to come up here and take some time with a combo wrench to make it happen. Okay, all the bell housing bolts are nice and tight. Now we're going to completely unhook the engine from the crane and let the transmission all the way off the jack. We'll roll this stuff out of the way and then tighten the engine mount to block bolts. Okay, that's all the mount to the block bolts tightened. Now let's try to get this through bolt tightened. This is 7/16 bolt, so I'll say maybe 50 foot-pounds, but we will see how it goes. Put this wrench here on it. Hopefully that'll just get jammed against the block and prevent it from turning if it decides to. I got a large selection of extensions I'm going to roll onto the truck with. I don't remember what it took to reach it last time, but I'll figure it out. That's 50 foot-pounds. Well, the torque wrench is set to 50. With all those extensions, there's definitely something being lost there, but that's fine. Okay, that's the mounts tightened. So I didn't get the torque wrench to click on this side because I don't know how well this plays in video, but you can see those ears on the mount are once again not straight. So it was bending that ear because they were spaced too far apart. So that could use like 2 more washers, but then the bolt would be too short and I wouldn't want to do that. So great job, TransDapt. Super cool that the parts that you included in the kit don't fit each other. So now all the engine mount bolts are tight, the engine to transmission mount bolts are tight, and I tightened the transmission mount nuts to 30 foot-pounds. So everything is solidly in there. Now we have to start putting all the little things together. First up, before we do anything else, let's get the pulleys on here. Okay, here's our nicely lazily painted crank pulley. We'll drop that in there. So I'm putting in the pulley bolts, just finger tight, and I'm putting anti-seize on them. And then we'll install the balancer bolt with some blue medium strength Loctite. And now we're using the big washer that came off of it in the first place. Hopefully we can get that tight right now so I don't have to deal with it later. Let's see. We'll tighten the crank pulley bolts first. Let's say 25 foot-pounds for these. Now let's see if we can't get that balancer bolt to 60 foot-pounds. So if we can't get it tight now, we'll jam something in the flex plate or whatever, and then get it tight that way. Whew. That was not easy. And then yeah, I'm gonna come back and get these pulley bolts to 30 foot-pounds. That pulley's done. Let's get the water pump pulley. I also cleaned up and painted this pulley. And we will use a medium strength thread locker on these pulley bolts. Okay, let's just use a screwdriver between the bolts to hold this still while we tighten it. Next, let's get the alternator back on. We'll tighten the through bolt to 25 foot-pounds and the little top one to 20. Something I'd really like to come back and do is make a new brace for the alternator that braces from somewhere up here down to like an intake manifold bolt, because the original accessory drive system used a couple of those, but because it's a different intake manifold and a couple other things have changed, none of the braces line up with anything. Short term it'll be fine, but long term I want to make some kind of brace to stabilize this whole unit. So that's the serpentine belt installed. Much easier to do that before the radiator goes in. First up, I'd like to get the torque converter bolts installed, which is annoying to do by yourself, but I'll show you how we can do that. You can see I just put a zip tie on here between the bell housing and the torque converter, just to make sure it wouldn't go anywhere. But now we can cut that off, and we'll try to get everything lined up so we can install the torque converter bolts. So first thing is you want to have your pads and line that up with the torque converter. So the torque converter has to be installed at a specific distance. If it's installed too far forward, it won't engage the transmission pump all the way. If it's installed too far rearwards, it'll be jamming everything together. So the ideal distance between the torque converter and the flex plate here would be something like 3/16 of an inch, I think, or 1/4 inch even would be fine. But this one, as you can see, has something like 3/8 of an inch of a gap. So we need to space it out. And I've already figured this all out, so it just uses 2 washers here between the flex plate and the torque converter that spaces everything out just right so that the torque converter is installed far enough into the transmission. There's 2 concerns there. One is if the washers aren't even or aren't flat all the way, there could be an imbalance or maybe be holding things together a little uneven, and that wouldn't be great. Not too concerned about that. But the bigger thing is if the torque converter isn't far enough forward, the snout of the torque converter also won't be engaged all the way in the crankshaft. And then that'll really cause a vibration, and you'll feel that one. So we'll reinstall it just like it was because it seemed perfect. So we're putting these on with a big blob of blue Loctite on them. Hopefully keep things together. Get the washers on it. Okay, and we'll do that for all 3 bolts. So we'll go back up and rotate the crankshaft. Okay, so all 3 bolts are started. Now what we need to do is move the torque converter as far forward as it'll go. So I'm pushing it forward, tightening the bolt a bit, pushing it forward. What I'm not doing is really reefing on this thing and forcing the things together. Now the torque converter is seated in the crankshaft and we can snug up these bolts. If you have two people, you can line this stuff up better and just use a ratchet if you can find a spot for it. But this will work just fine. Okay, all three torque converter bolts are now snug. So in order to tighten those yourself without the crank just turning, what I do is you put the breaker bar with a 6-point socket on that crank bolt, turn it where you need it, and jam it against the ground. Make sure it is as parallel to the balancer as you can get it. Jam it up like that and it will not go anywhere. So these get torqued to 35 foot-pounds. And now we will try to get the starter installed. So the starter is hung on here with one bolt because it's much easier to get the wires on when it's not so close to the block. Oh, and this piece right here that hooks onto the back of the starter is a starter brace. These are made by GM, but they weren't really stock on too many things. But ever since I cracked the housing on one of these starters, I've been using these and have not had any issues with them since. It just makes everything more stable. Alright, so the starter and the brace are all hooked up and torqued to spec. Starter bolts get torqued to 30 foot-pounds. And we'll hook the ground cables back up. You can see I sanded the paint off there to make sure it's a nice good electrical connection. The ground for the frame is on the back of the driver's side cylinder head. Okay, now we'll install the inspection cover. And don't forget, we're using washers to space it out, just to give a little extra room for those torque converter bolts. That's on. And I loosely screwed in the distributor hold-down plate. Next we'll install the radiator, so first let's get on the lower radiator hose. Okay, now we can drop in the radiator. I connected the power steering pump hoses and routed a couple of these wires and connected this top heater core hose. So the top is held in by this part of the original fan shroud. And same thing on the bottom, it's just a cut piece of the original fan shroud. And then I made these little brackets that hold onto the edge of it just for extra security, since I don't really trust this to hold onto it well enough. So I actually bought a transmission oil cooler for this thing, but I stared at it and thought about it and I just don't feel like doing it right now. So we're going to reinstall everything the same way it came out, and then in the future install that transmission oil cooler. Now I'll reattach the hoses and the oil cooler lines. Okay, now that all the radiator hoses are connected except this upper one here at the thermostat housing, we can fill the engine and most of the radiator up with water. When we do this through the intake manifold here, it'll get almost the whole engine full of coolant, so that the engine already has coolant in it as it starts up the first time. And we'll slowly pour it in, let it drain, pour it in, let it drain until it stops draining. We're just using a 50-50 mix of distilled water and antifreeze. So now as we fill from the radiator and the top of the engine, you can hear air bubbling out as it escapes from all the little cavities, or most of them at least. The higher we fill the radiator, the more pressure there is filling the engine with coolant and water. So it's forcing the air out of those spaces and bubbling up through the thermostat housing. Once everything is filled to the point where I start seeing the water in the radiator as I'm filling it, we'll connect the upper radiator hose. Okay, now let's get the Y pipe reinstalled. So I'm going to go ahead and hook up the front drive shaft and then install the Y pipe. So this core plug here is actually leaking a little, it's weeping. Like I mentioned when, I believe when we were putting them in, that sometimes happens when you install them without sealer. That should go away the first time it gets up to temperature. But we'll have to keep an eye on it. Since we've turned over the engine and completely lost our spot there, I'm going to pull out the number 1 spark plug and turn the crank until I'm starting to feel pressure in the cylinder. If you can turn it, wait a moment, and then remove your finger and air releases, that means the valves are shut and it's traveling upwards on the compression stroke. Then we'll turn it to 0 degrees on the timing tab, and that should be top dead center on the compression stroke, which is how we're setting the distributor. Okay, now we will drop in the distributor. So getting the distributor to mesh with the gear on the cam can be a bit of a tricky process. Basically, you need this slot to line up with the slot on the oil pump, and you need to mesh this gear with the one on the camshaft. And you have to lead it by like a tooth and a half so that you have the rotor pointing where you want it to. So you want to mark for the number 1 cylinder on your distributor, you line the rotor up with that, and then you go past it again just under 2 teeth, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 teeth on here. And then you look to see where the oil pump drive is in relation to that. It's pointing like this right now. And then you can either take a screwdriver, or I'm going to use the oil pump priming tool, and I'll turn the oil pump drive shaft to be facing that way, so that as we drop it in and then the gear follows, everything will hopefully stay together. Further back, that. Okay, yeah, I think that's where we want it. I'm going to lift the clamp up over it and just get that bolt finger tight. We definitely want to still be able to turn it, but it's nice to get that in place right now where you can get to it easily. In a lot of vehicles you could install the distributor with the cap already on it, but because of this overhang here, there is just not enough room. And now we can get the coil cover on. Make sure you get that ground under the screw. And there's so little space to reach this back screw. I'll show you what I have been doing. It's just taking a little screwdriver bit and turning that with a 1/4 inch wrench. I'm going to mess with the throttle cable bracket just a little bit, because while it did shift correctly, I would like to get a little more adjustment space out of this. The TV cable was a little far forward, so I'm going to push that back a little bit. We'll test fit it, I'll weld it, and we'll slap it back on. But first, let's actually get all the spark plug wires hooked up. So standard small block Chevy firing order 1843657 So the plug wires are all here from last time, so this should be pretty easy. I'm not going to route anything, just got to make sure to double check that firing order. Just going to put a drop of oil on each of these studs. And we will pull out the paper towels. I just sprayed some WD-40 on the bottom of this gasket, so hopefully it'll come back off if and when we need to. And since this was sitting for a little while and I didn't really drain it or anything, just kind of drop the floats a couple times, and hopefully nothing is stuck or dirty or whatever. Put that back on. There's the throttle cable. Oh, see, I'm glad I checked, because this needs a little bit more angle to it. Okay, that seems pretty good. It's got at least a few clicks worth of adjustment, and that's all you would ever need. The distance and the direction of both of them looks pretty good. What I'm going to do is weld this together, and if I ever need to adjust it again in the future, I'll either cut it apart and do it, or I'll just get an adjustable one and cut my losses with this stupid thing. Well, that's certainly welded now. Okay, let's fill the power steering fluid. So while the paint is drying on the throttle bracket, I set up gauges, oil pressure, vacuum, and attack that will help break in this engine and make sure everything is going okay.